Today, we're revisiting the Nikon Z7 II, which originally released in the year 2020, and we're seeing if it's still relevant today in 2025. So just after the holidays, I got tempted by the Nikon Z8 again. It'd been a little while since I'd bought anything big photography-wise or anything like that, and I was like, maybe I should take another look at the Nikon Z8. So I took a look at it, and by this point, I have friends with it, and everyone's really happy with it. It seems to be a really great camera. I don't really know of anyone that has a Nikon Z8 and isn't happy with it. And while it was tempting, I paused a moment, took a little bit of time to think about it, and I thought back to a video I did on this topic earlier about the Nikon Z7 II, and why I was going to stick with it instead of upgrading the Nikon Z8. And really, those things I talked about in that video, which I'll link down in the description below, are still relevant today. And then when I looked at the price, even with the Nikon Z8 on sale, it still hovers right around $3,400, which is just a lot of money. What I did is I took that amount of money, I was thinking about where could I go if instead of buying a camera, I spent that money on trips. And that would be at least 2 trips out to Death Valley and even more trips regionally. So I really decided to just sort of put a pause on that and stick with my Nikon Z7 II. So I decided to do this video where I talk about why I think the Nikon Z7 II is still a great camera and can serve us very well going into 2025 as a landscape photographer. So first, let's start with taking a look at some of the key features of the Nikon Z7 II that I think are still highly relevant today and sort of factor into my decision about why I think the Z7 II is still a great camera as we are in 2025. First, it's a high-resolution sensor. For me, the Nikon Z7 II sort of is in the sweet spot with a 45.7 megapixel sensor. To me, as someone that does habitually crop, I tend to take an image, shoot a little wide, and crop in on it. That 45.7 megapixels gives me plenty of room to work with and still end up with a high-quality image. There can actually start to be some cons with the higher megapixel images as you get into it when it gets around into noise and everything like that. So to me, 45.7 megapixels lets me do everything I want. Both supports my cropping habit, and it also lets me print pretty large without any kind of problems or without having to do any kind of scaling or anything like that. So I really think the Nikon Z7 II still sitting at 45 megapixels is a great resolution for a camera, so I'm happy with that. So next up, we've got dynamic range. With a base ISO of 64, we have lots of dynamic range to play with, either to capture those highlights or capture those shadows all in one shot. And as a landscape photographer, that's one of those things that's sort of important to me. While I still do exposure bracket here and there when the situation is really far apart, very high dynamic range, the more often I can catch what I want in one shot, the happier I am. I just like being able to sort of get my composition, get my exposure set right, and sort of be able to catch everything from the highlights to the shadows in one frame. And the Nikon Z7 II lets me do that quite a bit. Now there are, like I said, still times when I'm going to sort of bracket something, especially sunrise, sunset. You'll tend to take that shot, get the exposed for the highlights, get the shot to expose for the shadows, and then blend them in post-processing. But I can usually do that in 2 shots, sometimes 3 at worst case. So that's been a very nice feature for the Nikon Z7 II. Just makes my job in the field easier, makes me more efficient as a landscape photographer, and so I do appreciate that higher level of dynamic range that you get with the Nikon Z7 II. Next, we lead to some of the physical features of the camera that I think are important for someone that's regularly out in the element and out in nature and photographing in tough conditions. First up is the weather resistance, the weather sealing on the camera. This camera has done great in all sorts of environments. I've had it out in bitter cold, I've had it out in snow, I've had it out in rain. And while I do take care of my camera, and if it's a downpour, I will cover it between shots or something like that, I really have no worries. I am able to take this camera out and use it like the tool it is in the conditions and the environments I like to go out into. One of the things I've learned as a landscape photographer, you really want interesting pictures, is you need to go out at those times when not everyone else is going out. So that's periods when it's cold, when it's rainy, when it's snowy, when it's foggy. All of those situations contribute to being able to capture some very interesting pictures, things people don't always see. And so far, over the years of use with the Z7 II, it has held up to every condition I've had it out in and has given me no pause in being afraid to take it out. So like I said, occasionally a very heavy downpour, I will cover it. I'll cover it with a hat, or sometimes I'll have a plastic rain cover to put on it. And while I'm getting the shot set up and everything like that, I'll keep it somewhat protected. But I have no problems taking that cover off to sort of really work the shot, have full access to the controls, and I've just had no problems with that. So the weather sealing is a super nice advantage to the camera and makes it still relevant today. Like I said, this camera has dual card slots, and that is super important to me. I actually did not get a Nikon Z6 or Z7 initially because I only had 1 card slot, and I just wouldn't work for me. So when the Mark II models came out, had the dual card slots, that's when I made the leap into the Nikon mirrorless system. So this camera has a CF Express card right here, Type B, and it has an SD card right here. For anyone that takes their photography really seriously, I find having dual card slots is important. It does a couple things. One, it gives me an immediate backup right on the camera. If one One's going to the CF Express card, one's going to the SD card, and I've got that backup right there. So if one of my cards were to corrupt, the other card should have the images on it and I should be fine. The other thing that's handy is when I'm out traveling or something like that, if I don't have time to do my normal on-the-road backup process, which is actually copying files off of the camera to an SSD drive, I can always pop out this SD card, and I've got my files on it, so I can separate it. I can put this in a safe, secure place while this stays in the camera bag, and I'm able to sort of get that redundancy that I want by having the dual card slots. So I think that's a super great feature, and really it is a very important feature to me as a landscape photographer that does some traveling. It just sort of gives you that added safety net to be able to protect your images while you're traveling on the road, even on long day trips. Next up, I want to talk about lens options. The Nikon camera system, the Nikon ecosystem, in my opinion, has a really great set of options for lenses. A very high degree of image quality. You just really can't go wrong with Nikon lenses, in my opinion. So being able to have those lenses at my option, I think, are really good. So now these days, I've pretty much settled on my standard carry being the Nikon 14-30. Which we got right here. This is the wide angle lens I use. It's an f4 version, so it's nice, light, packable. Super important to me as a landscape photographer is the weight and packability of things. So this lens is super nice for that. Next up, I use the 24-120 lens. Again, it's an f4 lens. It's very versatile, 24 millimeters to 120. So you can use it as a one lens approach if you need to. So if you're traveling or something like that, don't want to take all of your lenses, you could go with a 24-120 f4. High image quality, great option there. So this is the second lens I tend to carry. And then, of course, we got the Nikon 100-400, which I've talked about many a times at my journey at enjoying and appreciating the 100-400 millimeter focal length. But this right here is the Nikon 100-400. Now, this lens is obviously much bigger. It's heavier, but the image quality on it is just great. It's an S-series lens, so it can handle the elements and the whole bit. So just sort of getting into that whole ecosystem, I'm really happy with the Nikon glass. I've always been happy with it, so that works out really well. Now, that's not to slight other camera systems or anything like that, but I've just been really happy with my Nikon lenses. And beyond that, if you're making the move to mirrorless, for maybe you've been shooting on DSLR a long time and you're here in 2025 today trying to decide which system do I go with, and you've got an investment in F-mount glass for your DSLR, being able to use the FTZ adapter on the mirrorless system really sort of gives you a nice pathway to make the move to mirrorless without having to rebuy everything at once. You can get your camera body, get the FTZ adapter, and then start adapting some of your older lenses, and then over time upgrade those lenses. So I think that path from moving from DSLR to mirrorless, the Nikon system has you set up really good. Now, that's not unique to the Z7 II, as long as you get into the new Z mount into the Nikon mirrorless cameras, but it worked really well for me, and I do think it's an advantage to the system, which pays off for the Nikon Z7 II. Okay, next we get into the size and weight of the Nikon Z7 II. I've talked about size and weight before, but to me, again, and I mentioned it with these lenses, is size is important because of how much space it takes in the pack. If I can keep things small in the pack, it either lets me use a smaller pack, have more room for safety gear, clothing, accessories, things like that. And the weight is always important because if you're hiking with it, we as landscape photographers, we tend to either hike long distances, hike over difficult terrain, and anything we can do to keep that weight down keeps us from getting tired and allows us to have more energy when we're actually at the spot doing the photography. Now, that was one of the advantages of mirrorless cameras, and initially was that it was smaller and lighter than your DSLR cameras. And the Nikon the Z6, Z7 II, I feel like did a great job at that. This is a pretty compact setup, weighs in about 1.3 pounds, just the camera body. And as camera manufacturers, Nikon included, have started releasing flagship models, something like the Z9 had an integrated grip. It's just a giant camera. It's just not friendly. I don't consider it practical for landscape photography in any form or fashion. The Z8, while it doesn't have that full-on integrated grip, still stands a little taller than the Nikon Z7 II. And that just sort of annoys me because I feel like I want all the power and capacity in here, and I still want to maintain this smaller form factor. So to me, that is actually one of the advantages that the Nikon Z7 II maintains, is that you're getting that advantage that we were promised from mirrorless cameras, smaller, more compact, lighter cameras. And the Z7 II, I think it found that really good spot, that sweet spot for it, where it feels like a rugged camera, but it's not too big, not too heavy. So that's an advantage to me with the Nikon Z7 II, and why I think it's still relevant today, and actually a big advantage over some of the newer models that Nikon's put out. And then finally, we've got the ergonomics of a camera. I've said many a time when it comes to camera systems, these days, if you buy anything within the past 5 to 10 years, the camera is probably not going to be the reason why you can't get good pictures. Today's cameras are just so powerful. They're light years ahead of what some of us started out with long ago. So it's really hard to go wrong, which is why, in my opinion, one of the key things to do when you're trying to choose a camera system, whether it be Nikon, Canon, Sony, whatever, is to go to the camera shop and hold them. Pick them up, hold them in your hand, and see what feels good. Where's the buttons at? Do the buttons make sense? Are they where you want them? Does it just feel good? For me, and this is subjective, another person may pick this camera up and not like the way it feels, and that's cool. But for me, I love the way a Nikon camera feels in my hands. This grip is perfect. You can just really get your hand in there. It makes it easy to carry one-handed, adjust if you're adjusting on a tripod. Just works really, really well for me. Now, some of this is probably muscle memory, but I like where the buttons are at. I know where everything's at. It's easy to get to my dials. I have no problems with that. So for me, ergonomics is important, and this Nikon Z7 II just fits just perfectly for me, which tends to make you happy to use it. A tool should stay out of the way. If it feels good in hand, that's going to help. But again, I get it. This camera is not going to feel good to everybody. That's why I highly recommend, if you're looking for a new camera system, pick them up. Try a Sony, try a Canon, try a Nikon, see which one feels best to you. In my opinion, it's almost more important than the tech specs of the camera. Okay, so let's roll over and let's take a look at some of the things that aren't so great about the Nikon Z7 II. Okay, so what's not perfect about the camera? Like I said, I've talked about what I like about the camera, and I've sort of honed in on the features that I think are big selling points today and why it's still relevant in 2025. But it's not perfect, and there are a couple of things that annoy me, and I want to be upfront about those. First, autofocus. For landscape photography, it works just fine. But if you are photographing wildlife, for sure, lots of sports, even events with fast-moving things, people dancing, Nikon's made some pretty big advancements in the autofocus system as you get into the Z8, the Z6 III, even the ZF. Those cameras have a better autofocus system. They'll focus better in low light. They'll focus better on moving objects. Wildlife is improved. So if you are photographing other genres and you're considering, do you stick with your Z7 II, or are you going to upgrade from a more entry-level camera or DSLR to the Z7 II, please consider what you photograph. I am photographing predominantly landscape photography these days. I will photograph wildlife if it wanders into my frame, but I don't consider myself a wildlife photographer. I know the basics, I know the camera settings, and I know the theory behind it. But really, unless that bear wanders into my frame or that fox wanders in my frame, I'm probably not seeking to go photograph that. So because of that, that super fast autofocus isn't quite as important to me, and what's in the Z7 II suffices. I will say the low light autofocus on the Z7 II, it hunts sometimes. When you're in those early pre-dawn hours or post-sunset hours and you're trying to get that shot, it'll hunt a bit, and sometimes I'll switch over to manual focus just to really be able to fine-tune my control. It's a minor annoyance. It's not a huge deal, so I don't consider it hugely problematic. But some of the newer cameras, something like the Nikon Z8 has starlight mode, which does much better at low light autofocus. So something to consider if you think that would annoy you greatly. It does not me. I've got a couple workarounds for it. It's not a deal breaker. But again, I predominantly shoot landscapes. Next up, the other thing that annoys me, and if you've watched any of my videos for any period of time, you can probably guess what this is, and that is the lack of a sensor shield. So the Nikon mirrorless cameras, specifically the Z7 II, the Z6 II, and a couple of the others, they don't have a sensor shield. So as soon as you pop the lens off, the sensor's exposed. There's nothing covering it. So because of that, you have to be really careful with lens changes because the sensor's open and dust, moisture, and all of that can get in there if you're not careful. Now, I've complained about this. The Nikon Z8 has a sensor shield, and I wish we had a sensor shield on this. I used to complain about this even more back in the day, but I've eventually come up with a couple of things that help with this. One, I'm very careful with my lens changes. I make sure I do them fast, so I've got things prepped in my camera bag so I don't have the lens off very often. I seek shelter when I can. I shield the camera, my body, so that the wind's not blowing dust and dirt into it. So I try to do those things to minimize how much dust and dirt is getting in here, but I still have to clean up a fair amount of sensor dust here and there in my post-processing. Beyond that, I've also developed sort of a system to keep the sensor clean, and so it's not quite as big of a pain as I used to make it out to be. Still annoying, but I use something, we got a rocket blower like this. So this rocket blower, you can blow that sensor off. You can keep it pretty clean with that. This is my big one I keep in the office, but I've got a smaller one I keep in my pack. So I can blow that loose dust off the sensor pretty easily in the field. And then, before I even have to make a leap to like wet cleaning the sensor, I use one of these nylon static brushes. This is the Nigel Danson one that he sold, but you can take this, blow the nylon bristles, and you can lightly run it across the sensor. It's not wet, and the static sort of pulls that dust off. And in most cases, if it's just dust that's not fingerprints, if it's not sticky or anything like that, you can clean it right up. And then in extreme cases, I have a wet sensor cleaning kit, and you can clean that sensor off. And after you've done it a couple times, you start to get used to it. It's not as intimidating as it was initially. So again, that lack of a sensor shield is more annoying than a deal breaker. I don't complain about it as much as I used to. Now I've just sort of refined my technique for lens swaps. I'm even more careful, just to take care with that. And between the rocket blower and the nylon brush, I really don't have to wet clean the sensor very often. So I've got it sort of under control, but want to call that out. And finally, one other little pet peeve about the Nikon Z7 II is that the newer cameras, specifically the Z8, has a two-way tilt screen, whereas the Nikon Z7 II, we can only tilt this. So if the camera's up high, you can look up, and if it's down low, you can tilt the screen so you can see it. That's super nice for that. Where the problem comes in is if you're doing a portrait orientation and it's way high up on the tripod, it's really hard to see the back of the screen. Same if it's really low, you try to get down really low to see it. So that's a little pet peeve. It makes those portrait orientation shots a little more difficult to see and compose. The Nikon Z8 fixes that with a two-way tilt screen. A Nikon Z6 III has a flippy screen on it, so makes it a little easier to do those. But that is something that it's just starting to feel a little long in the tooth to not have a screen that does at least a two-way tilt. So there is that as well. Now I've got other features I would like to see Nikon do if they did a Nikon Z7 III or something like that, or another camera in this form factor that was a high megapixel camera. I've done a video on that called my Nikon wish list. I'll link to it down in the description below. Feel free to check that out. I do talk about some other little small things I wish it had. Some is a mixture of what I'd like to borrow from the Z8 and things, but really, as far as this goes, I don't have a lot of big complaints about the Nikon Z7 II. But check out that Nikon wish list video if you want to see what I think Nikon should have in their roadmap for upcoming cameras. So since my video was made a little over a year ago where I talked about why I would stick with Nikon Z7 II, despite a little bit of small moment of temptation, I'm still happy I've stuck with the Nikon Z7 II, plan on heading into 2025 and using it throughout the course of this year as well. It's just a really great camera, and I think it's a really great option even as we come into 2025. Like I said, this video could be for you if you've got a Z7 II and you're like, should I upgrade? Am I missing out? Or maybe you're considering upgrading from an APS-C camera to a full frame camera. I think the Nikon Z7 II is still a valid option. And also for those people considering upgrading from DSLRs, being a landscape photographer, which camera should you slot into? I think the Nikon Z7 II is still well worth looking at in 2025. Now, of course, there's fear of missing out, FOMO. There's always this new gear coming out, like, oh, the latest, greatest, the Z8's out, the Z6 III, I should get it. It's really easy as a photographer to get caught up in gear and just to start thinking, well, my gear's older, I should upgrade. And I almost fell for it. Like I said, shortly after the holidays, I'm like, I haven't made a big camera purchase for a while. Should I upgrade? The Z8 gets, some great feedback, and it seems really well reviewed, and people seem to enjoy using it. Fellow landscape photographers are enjoying it. And I looked at it, but really I just couldn't find a compelling reason to upgrade, and that money could be better spent on trips. Like I said, talking about that, price-wise, we're looking at like $3,400 on sale for a Z8, whereas the Nikon Z7 II is on sale for $2,000 right now. That's really not a bad deal. And even if you're doing the upgrade, buying something big, that still leaves you with like $1,400 to go take a trip. That's one trip to Death Valley for me, or several trips regionally with the money I save. And that will do more for your photography than the latest, greatest camera. Now, like I said, that's if landscape photography is your predominant genre and that's what you do, which is the case for me. If you do a lot of wildlife photography, I think there's potentially a case to be made for moving to something like the Z8, or even take the resolution hit and go into the Z6 III. The autofocus system there is much improved, and if you're shooting those faster moving objects where that autofocus would pay off, I think it's worth probably looking at it. But if you're a landscape photographer and that's what you're doing and you only photograph wildlife if it wanders into your landscape shot, the Z7 II is pretty great, and it's got great resolution, great dynamic range, and just great image quality from it, and it's held up to the conditions just fine for me. So like I said, if you're looking to upgrade, get into the system, this Z7 II is a great way to get into a very capable camera without breaking the bank. So based on my experience with the Nikon Z7 II over the past several years, and even taking this time to sort of reflect, I really think this camera is 100% still relevant in 2025, and it could serve you well. So, and if you're looking for an upgrade, or whether you're just convinced that I don't want to spend the money on more hardware, I want to spend it on trips, the Z7 II is going to serve us landscape photographers very, very well, even in 2025. But what do you think? Do you have a Z7 II? Do you feel the same way? Are you considering an upgrade? Is the Nikon Z7 II on your list of cameras to look at? What are your thoughts? What are you going to do? You going to stick with it? You going to upgrade to it? Or are you going to skip this and look at like a Nikon Z8 or Nikon Z6 III? Let me know in the comments down below what you think. And don't forget, I mentioned it earlier, if you want to see my Nikon wish list, I'll link to that video here. And I encourage you to take a look at that. I do mention some other things that I wish Nikon would bring to the table. They're just little small things, nice to haves. But if you want to see that, be sure to check out that Nikon wish list video. And thank you for watching.